Howdy, partners. If you have a true scary story of your own or allegedly true scary story of your own that you would like to potentially hear on my channel, I'd absolutely love to read it, but I need you to send it in. It's in the description of every single video. I think it's like towards the upper part, but I'm going to have it. I'll have it on the screen right now as well. Email it to us and you could potentially hear it in the future. Even if you're not a fantastic writer, Zack is, so he can kind of work with you and get the cliff notes for the story and then put it together. He won't exactly rewrite it, but he kind of will, at least in a legible form where it's a little bit more entertaining and or easier for me to read, which is really key because no offense, there's some really good stories out there, but people don't know how to write. And that includes me. I'm an awful writer. So yeah, I can't do it either, but Zack can. So again, this is kind of just like my bat signal putting out this. If you have a true scary story of your own and you'd like to hear it, email it to us or you can post it to my subreddit, either or. All right, that's it. That's all. Let's get into the stories. I'd like to start by giving a brief summary on how I came to know about the event in this story. I want to share this story as it was shared with me, an account that I believe to be 100% true. A girlfriend of mine, whom I was dating for several years back in the early 2000s, told me all about this bizarre occurrence. To better understand why I wholeheartedly believe the details of this story as she remembered it, and to emphasize the fact that there's virtually no possibility of any other logical explanation for what occurred, I need to explain a bit about my girlfriend. At the time, she was several years younger than me when I was 22 years old. I'm now in my late 40s. My girlfriend's name was Jenna. She was extremely sweet and a little naive, endearingly so. A few facts about Jenna and her character were that on the rare occasion when she would attempt to lie or even maybe exaggerate a story when telling it to myself or anyone else, it was blatantly obvious. She was a very bad liar. I imagine most people can relate to somebody else in this way, or even yourself. I knew her well enough at the time that I was able to determine whether she was even slightly embellishing something for any kind of dramatic effect. I've shared this story that she told me with later girlfriends, work acquaintances, my close friends, and even my family. While donating a small portion of my precious time on Earth, doing a short stint in prison, I would recount this to a small group of my fellow inmates gathered around my bunk in the evening. Every single one got chills. Many were completely freaked out, and knowing that I was not bullshitting any of them. It was the early 2000s. I was living in Central California, San Joaquin Valley, which is near Bakersfield, specifically. I grew up in a town between Fresno and Bakersfield. As I mentioned earlier, I was dating a girl named Jenna, and by the time she had relayed the story to me, we'd been together for quite a while. I was well acquainted with her idiosyncrasies, her inability to lie or stretch the truth convincingly. On the day this all took place, Jenna was driving to her aunt's and her female cousin's apartment inside town. I think specifically to visit her cousin, who was around the same age she was at the time. And Jenna was very close with her cousin. Either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who in the family you asked, in this apartment, her aunt and her female cousin, whose name was Stacy, lived there alone. Stacy's father had been out of the picture apparently for quite some time. A very common scenario in my experience. Jenna's closeness with her family afforded her a pretty much unrestricted access to all her immediate family's homes and apartments, also having spare keys for most of them. She was welcome to come and go, for the most part, as she pleased. This also included unannounced visits. I honestly cannot remember specifically if we had cell phones back then for normal use. Me and most of the people that I associated with, we would be referred to as the poor white trash group in my formative years. Anyhow, point being that Jenna, going over to her aunt and cousin's apartment that day, did not require a phone call to them to announce her visit, so she came without invitation or even notice, driving up to their apartment that afternoon. As described to me, the apartment complex was 2 floors, with a dirt patch near the street that could be parked on, but the tenants' parking was in the rear of the building, with all the front doors facing the street. These apartments had one entrance and no access out of the back, as I was told, and knew from driving there many times around the area in the past. There was one large window in the front of each apartment, though none in the back, nor on the sides of the apartment. This complex was not the best of places, but apparently her aunt had her own room, as did Stacy. Jenna had driven over, parked in front of the place, and the tenant parking in the back. She had no reason to believe that either one or both of her family members weren't at home, as she would not see their vehicle from the front side of the street. Jenna did as she normally did, headed upstairs one flight, walking 3 apartments down to her aunt and cousin's door. She tried the doorknob and found it locked, then used her key to open up the door without knocking. Again, this was also not uncommon, even though the apartment complex was not in the most glamorous part of town. Jenna still knew that she was more than welcome to enter semi-unannounced, so after unlocking the front door, she stepped inside. Upon entering, she didn't see her aunt nor Stacy, so she called out, "Hey guys, it's just me." Getting no reply, Jenna then began walking down the short hallway that led to the bedrooms in the back of the small apartment. The first room to her right was her aunt's, but she glanced inside of and saw no one. She called out again, "Hey Stace, it's Jen." To this, still no response. Jenna then headed further down the hallway to the next room, which was Stacy's. Jenna recalls that she was fairly convinced that no one was at home, since it would be nearly impossible not to have heard her when she announced herself more than once inside that tiny space. The lights in the apartment were, for the most part, all turned off, with the exception of her cousin's room, oddly, the room's light illuminating the hallway faintly. I assume just for the sake of thoroughness, Jenna walked a few steps to her cousin's doorway and turned to look inside. To her left were her cousin's dresser drawers, and directly in front of her was her cousin's bed, where Jenna saw Stacy just sitting there, upright but motionless on the edge of her small mattress, facing away from Jenna and the doorway. Jenna was momentarily surprised, as most people would be in that situation. She assumed that had there not been something wrong, her cousin would have obviously replied to her when she first entered the apartment. "Hey, Stace, what's up, girl? Are you okay?" Her cousin, still sitting on the edge of the mattress, made no movement in response that would indicate that she was even aware Jenna had said anything to her, or even aware Jenna's presence at the doorway to her room itself. Now she became increasingly concerned about her cousin, so Jenna began moving further into the room, confused by Stacy's strange behavior, imagining worst-case scenarios spinning in her mind that could explain Stacy's rigid, unmoving posture. When at that same moment, as she neared the end of Stacy's bed, her aunt's voice came from the living room area, as well as the familiar sounds of the front door opening, and what was most likely, someone with arms full of grocery bags or other heavy items being shuffled into the kitchen, all while having this casual conversation with a very familiar voice. The familiar voice of Stacy. It was unmistakable. As she continued to listen to the commotion in the kitchen, Jenna was now in this semi-state of shock and confusion. Her face pinched and eyebrows furrowed. Her brain was trying to rationalize, make sense of all these contradicting sensory inputs, all in less than a second of actual time. Though seemingly it felt like a movie scene, set to slow motion for Jenna. Finding her voice, Jenna softly called down the hallway. Auntie, it's Jen. I just stopped by. I came by to..." She paused herself mid-sentence. Her voice trailed off, replaced by the thumping of her own heart. A cold dread washed over her as she slowly turned back towards Stacy's room. To her absolute horror, the figure on the bed had turned its head in this unnatural way, without moving its shoulders or lowering its body at all. Gone was the familiar face of her cousin. Instead, this grotesque stared back at her, skin gray like campfire ash, sharp angles where there should have been curves, with this emotionless gaze. The eyes were black pits, devoid of life, not angry but slightly squinting, reflecting the image of herself in them as she stood there in front of it, vulgar and defying her reality. She screamed, the sound ripping through the little apartment. She bolted down the hallway, bursting right into the kitchen where her aunt and Stacy were unpacking groceries. "Auntie, Stace, there's something in Stacy's room." her words tumbling out in this frantic jumble. Her aunt and cousin looked at each other and then back at Jenna. "What are you talking about, Jenna?" Stacy asked, likely confused that her cousin had just emerged from the back of their apartment. "We just got home a minute ago." Jenna grabbed her cousin's arms frantically. "No, there's another Stacy. She's not right, and she's in your room." Three cautiously returned to Stacy's room. Jenna, her body shaking visibly, hesitating to look inside, but now the room was empty. A chill ran down Jenna's spine. The demonic-like entity that defied description, so horrifying that her mind felt unhinged as it struggled to process it, was now gone. But she knew what she'd seen. It wasn't a hallucination, not a trick of the light. Something else entirely. Something evil that had worn her cousin's face like a mask. The only sign of recent occupancy was the bed. It had a faint indentation on the mattress where that thing had been sitting. Jenna's aunt and cousin searched the apartment, their voices hushed into sudden silence, but there was no trace of her cousin's doppelganger. No back windows to escape through, no hidden doors or exits, no access panels, service hatches, or even attic space, and no possible explanation for that sudden disappearance. She never went to her aunt's and cousin's apartment ever again, and I can't recall her telling me if they even stayed there much longer after that. The events of that day left a scar on Jenna's soul, and a chilling reminder that the world held mysteries far darker than she'd ever imagined. She could never quite shake that feeling that she glimpsed something truly evil, a creature that could mimic human form but possessed a soul as cold, as empty as the void. To this day, I can still see the fear in Jenna's eyes as she told the story about her encounter with the doppelganger. It was a fear that resonated deep within me, a fear that whispered of the unknown and the unknowable. Though years and years have passed, Jenna and I have gone our separate ways. The memory of her story still lingers and disturbs me and most of the people that I've retold it to. It's an unnerving and freaky reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are ones we can't explain away, or even explain to ourselves. It was a gorgeous autumn day about 20 years ago, and I'll never forget it. Me and a friend named Scott decided to go for a walk along the Jordan River Trail in Salt Lake City. We were both adult males in our 30s, fairly strong and in decent shape, medium build. Like any larger city, Salt Lake City has a fair share of its own crime. Ted Bundy even went to the University of Utah Law School, and occasionally a dead body would even be found, floating face down in the Jordan River. Anyways, as we hiked on the trail, we were both just enjoying the natural sounds, that feeling of being in the outdoors where all the other stress from city life just evaporated. But as time went on, it started to get dark. I told Scott that it wasn't really safe to be on the trail at night. I actually lived in the area, so I knew we should get back to the car before dark. The Jordan River Trail was a pleasant thing during the day, but at night it turned into the kind of place where drug deals gone bad would happen, leaving behind a trail of carnage. Scott was way more adventurous than me. He just laughed and told me to stop being afraid. We're two male adults. Nobody's gonna mess with us. He was much more of a fighter than me, the type to never back down from a fight. I started to get a little upset and irritated about his uncaring attitude inside the face of danger, so I said the first thing that came to my mind. "They will kill you and then throw your dead body in the river," which made him laugh even more. He refused to go back to the car, so we just kept walking while I started to smoke, which calmed me down thankfully, hoping maybe my friend would change his mind. It wasn't even 5 minutes later. This huge, scary-looking, intimidating guy, probably 250 pounds of muscle, came riding toward us on this bicycle. I'm a fairly good judge of character, and this guy was not the friendly type who you would even want to start a conversation with. He emanated a dark energy with this face that looked like he was always angry all the time. You know the type. The big city crazy type, who walked down the sidewalk screaming obscenities with anyone cutting a wide swath. His rabid dark eyes protruded out, with God only knows what kind of violent thoughts. Not the kind of person you would ever want to meet in an isolated area, But here we were, out in the dark with no one around except for this big, giant weirdo. I know what most of you are thinking. Really? Salt Lake City? Mormonville has a violent underbelly full of dark, seedy criminals and violence? Yeah, I know. But it's not common knowledge. The short answer is yes. Not sure how, but people end up here one way or another. The city harbors them and their behavior. It's just easy being a criminal here, honestly, just like it is in any city. We don't necessarily have drive-bys and stuff like that like other cities do, but there are violent offenders and junkies in the back alleys, just like anywhere else. He stopped his bicycle, blocked our path, and asked us for a smoke. I told him I didn't have any extra cigarettes, which was actually the truth, but he didn't believe me. We walked around his bicycle to get away from this crazy dude, and maybe made it 10 feet away, which made him more angry. The guy slammed his bike to the ground and starts coming after us. "You're smoking a cigarette, asshole, just give me one," he screamed. Clearly, this guy was coming off some kind of drug binge, veins bursting across his neck and his forehead. Every inch of his skin was bright red as he continued to lumber after us, reaching out with his huge bear paw hands. "Dude, this is my last one. I just killed the pack," I tried to explain. "Bullshit," he hollered, still coming right for us. At this point, my buddy realized I hadn't been messing around with what I said earlier, and now it was time to get the hell out of here. Alcohol stores close at a certain time here. No alcohol is sold on Sundays. So throughout the week, people like this can find themselves pretty desperate, and I assumed that was the case for this guy. We turned and start bolting back the way our car was. When I looked back, he wasn't chasing us, only walking in our direction. Then, funny enough, he yelled this: "I'm gonna kill you both and throw your dead bodies in the river." I was stunned and horrified in the moment. I literally had just told my friend those exact same words earlier, if we didn't go back to the car. This guy was big, strong, and crazy enough to do exactly what he was threatening. What a bizarre, unsettling coincidence. We walked at a fast pace for another 10 minutes, trying to get away from this psycho, during which time my friend Scott had become a believer that we should in fact get out of here, and we should have left earlier. That normal Billy Badass fighter attitude was replaced by fear that I'd never seen before. It's getting darker by the minute, and we needed to get back to the car. I found a broken tree branch about the size of a baseball bat in case this guy was waiting for us on our way back, and Scott picked up a large rock, heavy enough to do some serious damage if needed. I highly doubt those improvised weapons would have even scared that big guy away. Thankfully, we made it back to the car in one piece though, without seeing him again. And I've never hiked that trail since. The next week though, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a headline in the local newspaper. A corpse had been retrieved from the shorelines of the Jordan River, which was literally the exact same area that my friend and I encountered that whack job. I was stunned and totally in shock at what I was reading. I then looked at the time and the date of that whole incident. They'd found the body the next morning. The victim had been wandering around the exact same area that me and Scott were. When they arrested a suspect, I already know who it was, and so do you. It was that giant guy who asked me for a cigarette, who said he'd kill us and throw us in the river. It turned out he encountered a few more folks out there, and when someone else had told him no like I did, they hadn't been quick enough in getting away. He'd bashed their head into the ground, then literally tossed them into the river, where they drowned. Absolutely heartbreaking and terrifying that it could have been me. Hi, Booze and Booze. First of all, thank you for your great content. I'll share the story because it's one of the more intense experiences that I've ever had. If you'd like to hear the other ones I have, I'll send them to you as well. Lastly, I want to say that I always look for rational explanations. Don't just believe in anything immediately, like proof and logical reasoning. Still, the following experience is one of the strangest things that's ever happened to me. I've shared this on and off throughout the years, just trying to gather different theories as to what could have possibly happened. I can't wait to hear what everyone thinks. It happened at my uncle's house back in 2001. A little backstory to give you more clarity about my experience. I grew up in San Francisco after I graduated high school, and I decided to move to a small town where my dad's family lives. This town was 3 hours south of San Francisco and had a population of around 70,000. It was a nice change to the big city life that I'd experienced for 14 years prior. When I finally moved, I went over to my uncle's house and asked if I could speak to him briefly. He said sure. Then he mentioned for us to move to the little table next to the kitchen, sit down and talk there. I asked him if I could live with him and my auntie for a little while, as I attended community college, adding that I didn't want to live alone in a new town that I just moved to. He replied to me saying, "I think that will be fine." I told him how thankful I was, and if he needed me to help out in any way, shape, or form, let him know. I left to grab my things. In a few hours, I returned. I only brought with me what I needed though: clothes, my books, toothbrush, and a few CDs. Almost immediately though, I felt a vibe that someone else was in the home, knowing that it was only my uncle and me at the time. It was a feeling when you go to a friend's house for a party, there are people walking around. The best way that I can describe it is just like a presence, like when you know there's other people in the next room, even without seeing them, or you know someone walked down the hallway. When you go to a party, you expect to find someone in every room. I don't know, it's really the only way I know how to describe it. It was very, very strange. It wasn't necessarily a bad feeling, but it immediately got my attention. And that was because it never really went away. It didn't matter if I was inside the house or outside in the yard. I never felt like I was home alone, even if my aunt and uncle were gone for the day. It always felt like someone would be right around the corner or sitting just out of sight. Very spooky and unsettling for a youngster just moving in. One day, I saw my uncle doing beadwork at the table, listening to a radio talk show. I asked him if I could sit with him and listen. He said, "Sure, come on and sit." I told him I wanted to talk to him about something that I experienced when I moved into the house on the first day. I also added that I hope he didn't think it was weird. I told him my feelings about there always being a vibe of other people inside the house when it was only me. He told me, "You know, I'll tell you this. All the years that I've lived here, I've had some experiences that I couldn't explain. They didn't scare me much, but I noticed them, and they definitely happened." I asked him to tell me one of the things that he saw. One night, I was watching the History Channel. I was home alone in the house. It was close to 9 p.m. and your auntie wasn't home yet from her late shift at the hospital. I was in my recliner. Behind me in the kitchen, I heard the drawers and the cabinets. I went to turn on the kitchen lights, and a few of the drawers and cabinets were opened all the way now. I watched his face as he spoke, and I could tell that he was being genuine with me. This was a man who had an experience alone and didn't really know what to make of it. Instead of reacting or getting afraid, he just turtled up and never told anyone. Like me, he was probably afraid of being seen as crazy. I could tell through his eyes, though, it happened to him. And now after my confession, he was revisiting it with a whole new perception. He wasn't scared, just perplexed, weirded out. We discussed it a little more, but ultimately decided there was nothing we could do except just keep an eye out on it. A few months later, I had my own experience. When my experience happened, I was the only one home. My cousin Mary was away, attending her first year at university, so I was given her room by my uncle when I moved in. I was walking down the hallway leading to the room one night. It was pitch black as it usually is. This being my uncle's house, it was far out in the country, the last house on the block next to a field. There were also barely any street lights to shine inward toward the home. I turned to the right, down the hallway leading to my new room. By this time, I'd grown used to walking in the center of the room, to pull the long string tied to the ceiling fan to turn on the light bulb. This ceiling fan was also in the dead center of the room. I was feeling around in the dark for that string, and then suddenly, I saw something darker than my pitch black room come toward me. When this thing came toward me, it started to push me out of the room. Of course, initially I thought it was a person, but while it was pushing me, I knew instinctually it wasn't human because it didn't have the characteristics of what a human being's arms and body would feel like. What would be this thing's arms and hands felt much bigger, and where the fingers would be, I would compare it to something like paws, without the nails or claws. It had that weird scratch pad-like feeling that kind of like a dog has. Additionally, I felt this thing go through me during the whole time it was pushing me. This is also hard to explain, but it's much like a huge blast of wind, but one that pushed through me as well as around me. I was powerless before it, then just found myself resisting nothing but darkness all around me. After the pushing stopped, I was finally able to see out of my left eye again. I found myself completely outside of the bedroom. I could not believe it. Was shocked and didn't understand what the hell just happened. You see, my bedroom and the bathroom have doorways that are very near one another, as they share a wall. When the figure came out and started pushing me, I was in my bedroom, but by the time I regained my vision, it had pushed me all the way out of the room and then partially into the bathroom. I couldn't believe where I was now standing, as I was expecting to find myself maybe a foot out of place at the most. When I actually measured the distance from the light pulley to the place that I found myself at, it was well over 8 feet. Like my uncle and his experience, I kept this to myself for a while. How do you confess that a darkness took shape and pushed you across the house? I didn't have any evidence of the attack, no scratches or bruises, just a creepy memory of something shapeless moving around me. I eventually told my aunt and uncle, who simply didn't have an answer for me. They knew I wasn't lying, as they had their own experiences, but what could really be done? Listeners, believers, skeptics, whoever, I'd love to know what you think I saw. If you'd like to hear more of my stories, just let me know. Thank you. In 1974, when I was around 10 years old, my family visited my grandparents in Cortez, Colorado. We would visit them a few times a year. At the time, my family lived outside of Houston, Texas, so going to the mountains of Colorado was pretty exciting. The drastic dichotomy between the elevations and terrain was really something to behold at such a young age. Who knew parts of the world could be so wildly different, right? My grandparents' home was a little ways out of town on some acreage in the woods. There weren't many neighbors, if any, so the property itself was really rural, even by a local community standard. My grandfolks were tough old mountain folk who kept firewood by the cord and 4x4s in the garage. They liked to cross-country ski in the winter, spread out by the lake in the summer. It was always a beautiful time when we went to visit them. Cortez is this small town, located around 6,200 feet in elevation. It's surrounded by beautiful mountain forest and deep canyons and ravines. Some of the best outdoor recreation in the world happens right there, from fishing to legendary rodeo events. There's a lot of old history buried underneath Cortez, all kept current by the destination town that it is today. The story is back in 1974 though, a little before what the old-timers called the boom. Ever since I was a very little girl, I would wander off and go exploring, much to my parents' dismay. For some reason, I would just leave and explore without telling anyone. And yes, I'd gotten into trouble many times for this, but they never deterred me. My grandparents didn't really care either way, as they understood the call of the wild. It's not like I was disappearing for days on end and traveling miles through rugged backcountry, and usually just bounce around for a mile at most, or do big laps through the nearby woodland. So this day was no different. I had explored the area around my grandparents' homes many times in the past, but on this day, I took the little family dog with me to go out exploring. My walk started the same as past explorations did, by entering the forest next to the house. Now, there weren't any established trails in the area, so I wandered aimlessly for a while, until I came upon a wide ravine. I hadn't explored this area before, so I headed down to see something new. It's a fun area to explore. There are lots of pretty rock formations, beautiful trees, and lots of birds and lizards to see. Enchanting is how I would describe it all. Like nature could put a person underneath a spell in this area. Every sound, every texture I found completely soothing, so it was easy to keep going deeper and deeper into the wilderness out there. It was almost like it lured me right in. What I didn't know was there had been a big forest fire very recently in this area, and before I knew it, I stumbled into the burn area, The ash layer was so thick it puffed up every single step. There were small areas where the embers were even still glowing. Thick black trunks stood covered in soot, charred down to mere nubs as far as I could see. The beauty that I once found comforting very quickly turned into ugly dread. At first I was fascinated by the new sight. Seeing the thick ash and glowing coals was pretty interesting. Without realizing it though, I'd wandered very deep into the burn zone, and by now, I was carrying my little dog because it was no longer safe for her to walk. I assumed this would be safe for me because I could actively avoid hot spots, and since everything was so flat and lifeless, finding my way back would be easy. After a time, I realized that I was thoroughly lost. I looked around for something familiar, but the fires had totally transformed the landscape. What I perceived as flat was actually featureless, so there was nothing to guide me back towards the forest. Everything looked the same to me, so I started walking in circles, hoping to come across my tracks again, anything at all familiar to me to help me get home. Nothing turned up though, and I continued to get myself more lost, the terrain seriously getting unfamiliar. I started to panic. I had no idea how to get home. The wide ravine had narrowed considerably as I'd explored it. I started scrambling up the ravine, but this was a mistake, as the walls of the ravine became very tall and steep. I would slide down and land in a heap at the bottom. I was carrying the dog still, so I was trying to protect him during these falls. I ended up getting pretty seriously injured, pulled some muscles, bruised a few ribs, and bleeding from all over. I started crying. I felt helpless and hopeless. I was getting thirsty too. Me and my dog were covered in ash. My arms were aching from carrying him too. I was covered in small cuts from trying to climb out of that ravine. My feet were starting to get hot, and walking on the still warm embers. When I looked, it actually looked like the bottoms of my shoe were beginning to melt a little bit too, slowly losing all features. I tried several times to crawl up the walls of that ravine and get out, but every single time I would slide down, like before. Because of this, I was starting to lose all my energy. I knew that if I could ascend one of these ravine edges, I'd be able to see where the forest was and guide myself back home. But with my newly depleted energy though, I found that I could now barely walk. The panic escalated to new heights. I was frantic with fear and worry. I was praying to God to save me and my dog from my foolishness. It was then that I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was an animal that was hiding behind big boulders in the area. This caused a new flush of fear, also adrenaline. I froze in place and stared where I thought this creature was hiding. My heart was pounding so hard I couldn't hear anything else. I was ready to bolt if need be. After a moment or two, it crept out from behind the boulder, and to my complete amazement, it was a pure white mink. It still had its winter coat on as it was early spring, and winter coats tend to be white for survival, to help them hide. This one scampered out and made a little show to get my attention, which was easy because it was such a shocking color, but also much bigger than any other mink I'd ever seen before. They do live in Colorado, but are known to be pretty elusive. This one coming up to me seemed very out of character, especially in such a dire, arid area. Seeing this beautiful animal somehow caused my panic to come down several levels. I stared in amazement, and it stared back at me. It then started moving down the ravine, darting in and out of view. I followed the mink, and I didn't consciously do this. I think I was so tired and scared that I followed it automatically. Either way, I didn't let it get out of my sight for the next mile or two. Probably a solid hour of zigzagging, boulder hopping, and navigating really hot zones. Even then, if I took too long, the mink would wait for me. It was weird and completely mystifying, like a second little animal companion. Amazingly, as I followed it, it led me up and out of the ravine. I stood and watched this little guy venture back into the ravine and then out of sight. Now that I was clear of the burn zone, I could see just how far it stretched out. The ravine that I'd been in was just one little portion of that entire wildfire area, which I could actually see was still burning way off. The ravine looked to be one of the older zones, and now the fire had moved off a good distance. Still, it stretched out for what looked like several miles. When I looked around me, I realized I knew where I was now and how to get back home. The relief itself was immense. The mouth of this ravine spat me back out at the edge of the forest, so if I double backed, I'd intersect with a dry creek, which would eventually lead me back home. It was another hour or so, but it was safe and familiar, not burning with coals. I started the walk back to my grandparents. I didn't know it, but by the time I made it home, I'd been gone for several hours. I left in the morning and it was now afternoon. I could see my little adventure had caused the whole family to be sick with worry. My parents came sprinting the second I came into view, and my grandparents went into the house to make some calls, likely canceling a missing persons report with the county or something to that effect. I can only imagine what me and my dog looked like. I was covered head to toe in ash and blood from many small cuts. My knees and elbows were bruised. I even had a knot on my forehead that I didn't know was there till then. I was scolded and hugged at the same time by my family. Everyone was crying with relief. I spent the rest of the day getting treatment from everyone in the family, while they bickered about whether or not to drive me into the hospital. They ultimately decided not to, and just took care of me themselves. After I bathed and had a bite to eat, I was tucked into bed. My mind wandered back through my experiences of the day. Now safe and sound, I could think about how I was rescued by that mink. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. As I went back through it in my head, it became more and more unbelievable. Was it luck or something else? I imagined still being lost out there in the dark, stumbling and falling between boulders, my palms landing on searing hot surfaces unknown to me. A truly horrific vision. To this day, I know that little animal saved me. What's curious is the mink's coat was pure white. It wasn't covered in ash, though the landscape was thick with it. I'd been completely coated after my first 10 minutes walking through that area, so I can't imagine how it could have stayed so clean out there. You may scoff at this, but I feel like that mink was some form of divine deliverance. If I hadn't seen and followed that beautiful animal, who knows what my future would have held. No one knew where I was. How long would it have taken to find me? Hours? Days? Perhaps my little skeleton could have gotten wedged beneath a boulder, never to be discovered again. I'm still a wanderer all these years later. That ordeal didn't stop my hunger to explore. At 59, I still explore remote areas to photograph and experience the beauty of my country. But now, I always make sure someone knows where I'm going, and I carry a satellite communicator with an SOS button. I never want to feel that helpless and hopeless again, as I know there won't be a white mink to save me next time.